It looks like 10:15 to me.
I know everyone's in for not to start from now.
The scary pictures, which are great. Yeah. Oh, I think so. I think it's fine for little kids, actually.
A lot of words, they don't fit that one.
Oh, they can learn.
Maybe I just home.
7 words in one page. Too many.
All right. Well, I think we'll just go ahead and start. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Angie Hill, and I live in Casper, Wyoming. My husband is Pastor Hill. He's pastor at Mount Hope Lutheran Church, and he's the headmaster at our school, which is preschool through 8th grade. We have 5 children. Oldest is 17, and the youngest is 10. And they're all at our school, except for my 2 oldest that I've been trying to homeschool at the high school level. So I've gotten a chance to see a little classical education at the beginning and up through the high school level. And so some of the things that I say to you will reflect on that experience. I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan, Tolkien, and Dr. Veep. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you today comes from those sources. The title given to the sectional was Why Teach Children Literature? So if reading books is so important, how come you never see people on television doing it? Have you ever noticed that to answer a question, you often have to ask numerous other questions? If we play our little Socratic game from last night, I think we'll have to find that to answer this question, we'll have to ask a number of other questions. What is literature? What is the history of literature? What literature is appropriate for a Lutheran classical school? What does Luther have to say about education and literature? What is classical literature? So those are some of the things I'm going to try to touch on in order to answer this question. And really, just the fastest answer to the question of why teach children literature, why do we even bother doing a classical education at all? If we talk about literature as a subject, like Dr. Kopp was talking about, we tend to think of novels and fiction, Jane Austen or what have you, but as you get further down the line in a classical curriculum, literature involves reading things in political science and history and natural science, or natural philosophy, which is science, Euclid's geometry. Those types of things are considered literature as you go along in your classical education. That's what you're preparing your students to be able to read somewhere down the line. If you look at Dr. V's book, Reading Between the Lines, and I have a copy up there that you may look at but not keep, he gives us a very nice explanation of why Christians read. Why do we read? And I'll just quote him. Christians, to one extent or another, have to read. They are people of the book, whose spirituality and conceptual framework is centered upon the linguistic revelation of the Word of God. As the culture moves farther and farther away from the printed word, Christians still read. Because readers exert the most influence in society, however the masses amuse themselves, Christians may find themselves once again the thinkers and leaders of society. And that kind of plays into what Dr. Vies said, and Dr. Kopp, and I'm sure Dr. Hein. The education that we have, the classical education, is the education of a free person, not a slave, okay? The thinkers and leaders of society. Now we demand as Lutherans, or we read as Lutherans, so that we may know the truth. And the scriptures even demand that we continually seek the truth. It's a big part of what a classical education is, to discover the truth. Dr. Kopp said yesterday, quoted Luther, without literature, pure theology cannot endure. I just wanted to drag that out quick. But back to the truth. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, think on these things. And that's been one of our guiding passages, I think, for setting up our classical curriculum. And just very quickly, as we're going to talk a little bit about rhetoric today. If you see the words that I have in italics up here, this is a rhetorical device. Whatever things is used 6 times. As grammar teachers or English teachers, you put run-on sentence, mark it wrong. This is actually a rhetorical device called anaphora, and I can't promise that my pronunciations of these things are going to be perfect. The more you study rhetoric, the more you'll see these little things used in the Bible, especially in the epistles, but also in parables and the Psalms, a lot of Old Testament things. So we'll be looking at that a little bit today, too. Back to knowing the truth. My husband read this book. I kind of glanced at it. The premise is that if the Muslims had won the battle in 732 against Charles Martel, Western civilization would have been much better off. The world would have been much better. We would have had more advanced science and more tolerance. The world would have been better off. So I would say without a classical education, it's pretty hard to argue against what you're hearing these days about Islam. And another thing I want to point out very quickly, we were talking about classical Christian education. I've come across this more and more. The liberals are using classical education too. When you start getting online and looking for rhetorical websites or something like that, they have them too. They realize this is a strong form of education and they're going to try it. So as they said this morning, you can use it for a good or a bad purpose. The new atheist, that's something else that's coming out. Intolerance of ignorance, myth, and superstition. Disregard for the tolerance of religion. Indoctrination of logic, reason, and the advancement of a naturalistic worldview. The old atheists are Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Friedrich Nietzsche. And we have the new ones, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens. They have their own websites, and there are a bunch of those out there. So, as we see, the devil never tires of disguising his lies to ensnare us. We cannot warn our children of every single danger out there in the world because there will always be new ones. So what can we do? We have to teach them that there is such a thing as truth. And we can even teach them as many truths as we have time to. But we do need to prepare them for that time when they move beyond our schools and have to decide for themselves what is true. The literature and history that you teach your students will have a great impact on how your students will respond to ideas that challenge their faith. One other quick note. Sometimes a complaint against classical education is that this is all old stuff. What did you tell me, Lynn? The hard old stuff. It's all moldy, dusty, not relevant to us. But when you see these things, Islam, the new atheist, evolution, you find out that you can use the things that you've learned from the classics, from the ancients, to combat things that you're dealing with this day in your life. It's very contemporary. It's very applicable. And this is just kind of something fun. This is a response to the atheist. Thank you for showing how far elevated intellectual stupidity can go. So, why do we teach children's literature? That's our theme. My first answer for you is that we should know the truth. For Christians, the truth refers to things pertaining to our salvation. Jesus, God and man, died on the cross and rose again, but as Christians, we also need to be able to understand the world around us. So, politics, history, science, philosophy. We need to be discerning enough when we read these things not to be led astray. There it goes. So, we need to know the truth. Secondly, as Dr. Weiss points out very well, then once we do know all these things, we may use our knowledge to help our neighbor or help others. That may be teaching in the classroom, raising your children, preaching to the congregation, or waitressing, fixing cars, or herding cattle. Having a good understanding of the world around us cannot hurt us. And, lest we take ourselves too seriously, remember that literature is to be enjoyed. And this doesn't necessarily mean that every work that you read you're going to feel uplifted and jolly and happy. What it means is that literature allows you to understand another perspective, somebody else's ideas, somebody else's pain or confusion or joy, And those are ideas and things that are transcendent throughout time. So things that the people from ancient Greece and Rome experienced, love, birth, death, we still experience that today. Okay, so those are things that you get through literature, good literature. The other thing about good literature, just to note quickly, is quite often it's something you don't read just one time. You can go back and read it again and get something a little different from it. You can go back and read it again. A lot of it depends on how much you've learned in between readings. So good literature is something that you can read more than once. Just because you've read the Aeneid one time doesn't mean you never have to read it again. So anyway, with these ideas in mind, let's look for a second at how we would consider choosing literature for a classical Lutheran school. And the first thing I'd like to do is go back to Dr. Martin Luther. And we discussed truth and our first source of truth being the Bible, but is the Bible the only thing that we can safely read? For some are taught nothing out of Holy Scripture. Some teach their children nothing but Holy Scripture, and we should yield to neither of these practices. This is what Luther says. And then this is another fun thing. I had so much fun looking up these comics on the internet. This is a little library here, and all he has on his bookmobile is Bibles. So that's fun. So what does Luther say? Luther actually recommended a variety of literature to be taught in schools. Based on my experience, even preschool teachers may follow some of, or many of his suggestions. So first one, he says, you read the best commentaries. That's somebody like Augustine, Peter Lombard. Those are the types of things, something that's going to explain a little further the Scriptures. Things that teach languages. Now, this day and age, there are a lot of books even for very young children that can help you to teach Latin. I think they've got Dr. Seuss in Latin, How the Grinch Stole Christmas in Latin, and in Hebrew or French. I mean, there are a variety of things available in foreign languages, so you can have a lot of fun with that. I have a quote from Luther. Books that would be helpful in learning languages, such as the poets and orators, regardless of whether they were pagan or Christian, Greek or Latin, for it is from such books that one must learn grammar. And I think that's kind of interesting because perhaps, and this may be a little heretical, perhaps we don't have to teach grammar as a separate subject if we're teaching Latin. Maybe that would come along better. I don't know. Probably not a very developed thought, but something I've been considering for a while. Luther also says books on the liberal arts, so Cassiodorus, chronicles and histories. He says, for they are a wonderful help in understanding and guiding the course of events, and especially for observing the marvelous works of God. Actually, Luther has a lot more to say about this. This is a very, very abbreviated form. He also recommends Aesop's Fables, and this comes from this letter to the councilmen of all cities in Germany that they establish and maintain Christian schools. I think Dr. Kopp quoted that. So it's a pretty long document, and you might find it something interesting to read. Aesop's Fables, obviously you could do that with your preschoolers. They're all very, very short, and they love those little morals at the end. Now, if you think about Aesop's Fables or all this stuff that Luther recommends, it's all in the 1500s, and we've had quite a bit of literature written since then, correct? So I'm going to switch over here to a little C.S. Lewis to talk about, or to get some advice as to what we ought to read. I have a fairly long quote, but it's very hard for me to change C.S. Lewis's words, so I'm just going to read to you from him. This is what he says. Every age has its own outlook. It is especially good at seeing certain truths and especially liable to make certain mistakes. We all therefore need the books that will correct the mistakes of our own period, and that means the old books. All contemporary writers share to some extent the contemporary outlook. Nothing strikes me more when I read the controversies of past ages than the fact that both sides were usually assuming without question a good deal which we should now absolutely deny. They thought that they were as completely opposed as two sides could be, but in fact, they were all the time secretly united by a great mass of common assumptions. None of us can truly escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it and weaken our guard against it if we only read modern books. Where they are true, they will give us truths that we already half knew. Where they are false, they will aggravate the error with which we are already dangerously ill. Not, of course, that there is any magic about the past. People were no cleverer then than they are now, and they made as many mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. So, C.S. Lewis says, read the old books because they give us wisdom. And what are the old books of children's literature? Off the top of your head, we're normally inclined to say fairy tales, myths, fables. And I'd say you're right, except that these were not written just for children. These were written for adults and children. So when does actual children's literature as we know it begin to develop? It's about 150 years ago, so it's really not that old of a genre. Historians note that perceptions of childhood began to change with the Renaissance. Man began to think of himself as an individual and paused to see that a child, still developing, is not an adult despite his economic utility. Now think about that for a second, and later on we'll compare what he has to say with Tolkien, and you may just think about it yourselves a little. Anyway, we can see this change in perspective by the type of clothing children were wearing and the increased interest in providing education for all children. So we're very quickly going to race through the history of children's literature. Here's my first thing. Token for Children, being an exact account of the conversion, holy and exemplary lives, and joyful deaths of several young children. You can read that in your preschool class. Anything written earlier than 1715 was intended to teach such things as the ABCs, morals, and manners. The Puritans undertook the writing of such things that we saw here. That's 1715. This little girl was lying in bed dying of consumption, and she was terribly afraid she wasn't good enough to go to heaven, and spent her last few days fretting and trying to do good works. So, in 1678, we get John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which I've also read is not written initially for children, but for 200 years it was the most widely read and best beloved children's book written in English. It went through many editions and was a favorite book prize at church and school. So, very pietistic, not very helpful with our theology. Here's a little example of the New England Primer of Massachusetts. Has the alphabet, syllables, rhymes, biblical allusions, catechism, Lord's Prayer, Apostles' Creed. And these pictures, a lot of them come off the internet, so if they're not very clear, I'm so sorry. I couldn't expand them and keep any clarity. Isaac Watts, 1674 to 1748, is another Puritan whose hymns we have in our own hymnal. Our God, Our Help in Ages Past is his. He wrote didactic rhymes for children, such as, how doth the busy bee improve each shining hour, and gather honey all the day from every opening flower. But those that worship God and give their parents honor due, here on this earth they long shall live, and live hereafter too. So a lot of didactic, moralistic, highly moralistic literature is what's coming out here. Now, also being made especially for children was something called horn books. And horn books are also didactic. They've got their alphabet and maybe a prayer or something, and it's covered with this sheet of horn, transparent enough for you to be able to see through, but the kids can still chew on it or whatever, and it's got a little handle so it's easy to hold. Meanwhile, in France, Charles Perrault published histories or stories of times past with morals, 1696 to 1697. Mother Goose is also his. That was published soon afterwards. And Perrault is credited with Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, etc. And then here, this is kind of cute, Cinderella in the Glass Flip-Flop. So that's how we would write it today. With the improvement of the printing press, chapbooks appeared. These books were affordable for the general public. They were tales of heroes and adventures. They were stripped of all their poetic style, leaving gripping, popular action stories. These stories were popular even among the lower classes and children from 1500s to the 1700s. And I'll say this again in a little bit, but I just want to remind you that the first novel doesn't come out till 1739. And so up to this point, everything that is fiction is pretty much written in poetry. So poetry is very important in your curriculum, especially when you get to a point where you're having your kids go back and read something written before 1739. So this is going to be kind of a lengthy slide here. The years 1680 to 1715 brought change probably more significant and damaging than anything that occurred during the Renaissance. If you want an in-depth commentary on this time period, there's a book by Paul Hazard, and I can show you that later if you like. And he wrote The European Mind. In this somewhat eccentric little book, he explains the events that built up to John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he observes the repercussions. So, John Locke, 1632, 1704. He put forth the blank slate notion in 1690. Locke argued against traditional philosophers regarding the question, what is truth? So we have our truth being questioned here. He believed humans should base their ideas based on their own experiences. Environment shapes our behavior. Humans have no innate evil or good. Locke's moral system was based on the understanding that things are good or evil only in reference to pleasure or pain. That we call good, which is apt to bring us pleasure, whereas other kinds will bring us pain. Morality, then, has to do with choosing or willing the good. As the blank slate concept spread, parents and educators began to reconsider what would be appropriate for children to read. Fairy tales needed to be cleaned up so children would not be exposed to the wickedness of adults, and we must not frighten them with our corruption. It's also in the mid-1700s that John Newbery from your Newbery Awards opened a bookstore called the Juvenile Library, just for children. For parents, he advertised books intended for the instruction and amusement of Little Master Tommy and Pretty Miss Polly. Newbery invented what we now recognize as children's literature. Lovely paper, beautiful pictures. He published quality books with ample didactic content just for children. And then between 1712 and 1778, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he soon offered a new theory about human nature. He believed that children have a natural wisdom and that adult influences pervert that wisdom. Rousseau taught to provide educational situations for children that would allow them to reach their own conclusions. Children's writers began portraying wise adult teachers who guide children to truth by encouraging them to consider the moral and intellectual implications of their experiences. Maybe we'll talk about that later if you're interested. And we have, moving along here, the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, the Romantic era. So the perception of childhood evolved a little more. Now the general idea is that children were innocent. Their innocence was of greater value than any adult wisdom. And we find statements like this. They come to us from heaven with their little souls full of innocence and peace. That's your whole class, right?
No, it's not.
Or little saints upon whom safety and prosperity depends. So William Wordsworth and William Blake both wrote on the innocence of childhood. And by the mid-1800s, nonsense appeared, mocking the serious, instructive adult approach of earlier books. Lewis Carroll's How Doth the Little Crocodile poked fun at Isaac Watts' How Doth the Busy Bee. And I know people have bad things to say about Lewis Carroll, but we'll just move on to Edward Lear, who produced his book of nonsense full of zany limericks. Carroll and Lear played with words and brought back some of the joy of reading. The idealization of childhood has remained popular until fairly recently. The focus of today's literature for children seems to be tolerance and multiculturalism. You who work with young children probably could tell me more about it than I can tell you. And then there's this new genre that I'm going to call the potty talk books. Not real crazy about that. And it reminds me of, how many of you have seen Despicable Me? Good. You have to see it, Pastor Heine.
Write that down.
Okay, it's the best thing you'll get out of this talk. The villain Gru is going to read this story called Three Sleepy Kittens to these little orphan girls. And he's on the very first page, and he's reading it to them, and he stops and says, "Wow, this is garbage. You actually like this? They call this literature?" And that's really what a lot of our literature is these days. It's like somebody's making money off it. That's about it. Here is a very brief history of literature from 1484 to 1964. And it's interesting to see the philosophical thoughts of the day and how they're tied to our literature. And I think you can also see that a lot of the philosophical changes with the Enlightenment impacted our perspective on education. Our view of what children are changed the way our schools decided to teach. So, a lot of these are great books, so I don't want you to think that you shouldn't read them, but I just want to encourage you to consider the agenda that the author is going to have. Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's good. And you know what? You're going to read some things with your students that there's no way you're going to approve of every single thing in there. So it's just an opportunity also to discuss things with your class and a teaching opportunity. Now, let's see here. Choosing literature for a Lutheran classical classroom. Luther says commentaries, languages, histories, Aesop's fables. I'm going to talk about two other things that we probably don't normally give a lot of time to as far as literature, or they get a lot of complaints. One would be poetry, which I've never been that big a fan of poetry myself, but the further I get with my children at home at the high school level, I see you have to read it and understand it. And again, Dr. Beeth reminds us that most fiction was written in poetry until 1739. So all those great classic works are in poetry and have a great deal of rhetoric. And what you can do at very early ages with your students is start memorizing poetry, even if you think it's a little hard. And I can give you an example that I totally love. I read The Merchant of Venice with my kids this year, my high school students, and we start on this passage in here called The Quality of Mercy. I don't know if you're familiar with The Merchant of Venice, but there's a very nice section called The Quality of Mercy. We start reading it, and my son, who's 17, says, "I know that. Mrs. Garwood has memorized that in second grade." And everything I ever do with my kids, by the way, they learned in first and second grade with Mrs. Garwood. But yeah, they remember what you do in first and second grade. When you teach that poetry, that will come back and be useful to them. So even if it's hard, even if they don't understand all of it, that's okay. Go ahead and do it anyway. It'll be a big help later on. So go with the poetry. Also, let me encourage you to do a lot of fairy tales and myths and fantasy. And I'll spend a little time on this because I think this is a genre that gets the most criticism from Christian parents. Maybe non-Christian parents don't care, but I think our Christian parents sometimes say, how can you, this isn't something true. Don't teach my child this thing that's true. And these are scary, violent stories. Don't do that with my kid. So let's talk about the scary thing first. Oops. Here's a little picture from this book, Pegasus. And I can't say this word correctly, so if my Greek or something scholars can tell me that the chimera or the chimera, I don't know how it is, but it's the evil beast there. He's very scary, and every student that I've ever had and all my kids have loved this book, and they do not have nightmares about it. Child psychologist Bruno Bedelheim talks about children's literature and scary stories in this way. It says, "There's a widespread refusal to let children know that the source of much that goes wrong in life is due very much to our own nature, the propensity of all men for acting aggressively, asocially, selfishly, out of anger and anxiety. Instead, we want our children to believe that inherently all men are good, but children know that they are not good. And often, even when they are, they would prefer not to be." Bedelheim spent a great deal of time defending the value of fairy tales. His basic observation was that fairy tales show us that life is about trials. He complained about contemporary tales that failed to deal with things like death, aging, jealousy, pride, things that we see as the effects of sin, very relevant in our lives. Here is Baba Yaga of Russian folklore. She eats men, uses their skulls to decorate her fence posts. Her hut walks around on chicken legs, and she flies around on a mortar and pestle. Russians tell their children that if they don't go to sleep, Baba Yaga will come and get them. I'm going to just switch over here to C.S. Lewis and some of his thoughts on fairy tales and perception of childhood and scariness of fairy tales. Okay, so C.S. Lewis would agree with Bedelheim about perception of children, whether or not they're so innocent. Let's just look at that quickly. In his lecture on 3 ways of writing for children, he says, sentimentality is so apt to creep in if we write at length about children as seen by their elders. As the reality of childhood, as we all experience, creeps out. For we all remember that our childhood as lived was immeasurably different from what our elders saw. So as we get older, we tend to see childhood as something that we want it to be, and the sentimentality of it kind of creeps in. So he kind of warns about that, because kids know. They know what's going on. As for scaring children and having frightening stories, Lewis writes, those who say children must not be frightened may mean 2 things. They may mean that we must not do anything likely to give the child those haunting, disabling, pathological fears against which ordinary courage is helpless. In fact, phobias. So we don't want to give them phobias. His mind must, if possible, be kept clear of things he cannot bear to think of. Or they may mean, number 2, that we must try to keep out of his mind the knowledge that he was born into a world of death, violence, wounds, adventure, heroism, cowardice, good and evil. If they mean the first, I agree with them, but not if they mean the second. The second would indeed be to give children a false impression and feed them on escapism in the bad sense. And I'm just going to read you a little more Lewis, because I just think there's no point in rewriting what he says. Since it is likely that they will meet with cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker. Nor do most of us find that violence and bloodshed in a story produce any haunting dread in the minds of children. As far as that goes, I side impenitently with the human race against the modern reformer. Let there be wicked kings and beheadings, battles and dungeons, giants and dragons, and let the villains be soundly killed. Let villains be soundly killed at the end of the book. This is St. George and the Dragon. I do have a copy of it up there. Another one of the wildly famous books with my small children. More Lewis. And I think it possible that by confining your child to blameless stories of child life in which nothing at all alarming ever happened, you would fail to banish the terrors and would succeed in banishing all that can ennoble them or make them endurable. For in the fairy tales, side by side with the terrible figures, we find the immemorial comforters and protectors, the radiant ones, and the terrible figures are not merely terrible, but sublime. It would be nice if no little boy in bed hearing or thinking he hears a sound were ever at all frightened. But if he is going to be frightened, I think it is better that he should think of giants and dragons than merely burglars. And I think St. George, and I'll let you look at St. George very quickly here, or any bright champion in armor is a better comfort than the idea of the police.
Do you think that's why they're saying now that our children now have been so protected and so guarded? I think some of us had bad childhood, and we tried to do that to our children, to give them the best childhood, to keep them safe and keep their minds clear. And now they're saying that they have such high incidences of suicide and depression because of this, of our overprotectiveness, because we have not exposed our children to this type of thing. So anything bad is such a horrible thing. They don't know how to deal with it. Because I don't think because they haven't read things that, if you work hard, and
right.
Maybe that's what's happening.
It's probably a pretty complex problem that has more than one cause, but this probably ties in. I would say it would tie into it. Yeah. because through literature you experience things from somebody else's perspective, so you personally do not have to have that experience in order to learn of it. So you can, sometimes you really get off the hook by learning from somebody else's bad mistakes, not to do those things. C.S. Lewis also kind of has a clever way of talking about fantasy and fairy tales and imagination in his book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. So when you talk about true literature versus make-believe, C.S. Lewis gives his opinion here. He's got this character, Eustace Scrubb, who's pretty annoying. Have you seen the movie? I haven't seen the movie.
Yeah.
I've read the book, haven't gotten to this yet, but I will. So tell me if they point this out well in the movie. I'm curious. He didn't call his father and mother father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. Eustace liked animals, especially beetles, if they were dead and pinned on a card. He liked books if they were books of information and had pictures of grain elevators or fat foreign children doing exercises in a model school. Obviously, a certain amount of nonfiction is necessary, and C.S. Lewis wrote his fair share of it. Lewis's concern, however, is that when people focus entirely on scientific method, they abandon their humanity. Lewis understood human nature and the value of imagination. Creativity and imagination are gifts that allow us to create things that make our lives better and to empathize with our fellow man. Well, we're going to continue on with the story a little bit, and I apologize in advance for my pictures. Couldn't get very good ones, but let's see if I can use this. Dragons, dragon, dragon, dragon. That's the main thing I want you to see. These are all from the same story. I think this is from the original book, this black and white. So, Lewis sets Eustace in a situation where scientific information will not help him. Let us return to Eustace, all alone in Narnia, where he hears an unfamiliar noise. He sees a cave and there is smoke coming from it. Something was crawling. Worse still, something was coming out. Edmund or Lucy or you would have recognized it at once, but Eustace had read none of the right books. The thing that came out of the cave was something he had never even imagined. A long, lead-colored snout, dull red eyes, no feathers or fur, a long, lithe body that trailed on the ground. He never said the word dragon to himself. Now, not that it would have made things better if he had, but perhaps if he had known something about dragons, he would have been a little surprised at this dragon's behavior. Most of us know what we should expect to find in a dragon's lair, but as I said before, Eustace had read only the wrong books. They had a lot to say about exports and imports and governments and drains, but they were weak on dragons. Through his greed, later on in the story, Eustace himself becomes a dragon, and he is lonely and he realizes the value of being a human being. He wanted to be friends, this is a quote from the book. He wanted to get back among humans and talk and laugh and share things. He realized that he was a monster, cut off from the human race. In this character, Lewis cleverly showed us what he thought of people who focus entirely on scientific method, facts, and logic. They abandon their humanity, not live in a sterile environment. We get entangled in other people's lives, and relationships are inevitably messy. Things happen that we cannot explain. And so I think Lewis does a very nice job of letting people see that in his literature without being preached to. That's one of the things I like about him. He's not preachy. Hopefully I'm not being preachy. You have to tell me. Did the movie bring out these things at all? Yes? Okay. I might watch it sometime. So literature helps us to experience what other people feel and endure. It also helps us to expand ourselves. And when that happens, we're able to be more helpful to our fellow man. Now, for something completely different. Rhetoric. You're not at the rhetoric stage, right? And so, does anybody have any background or experience, or have you read much on that? We hear about it at every conference we go to, right? Grammar, logic, rhetoric. Most of us are grammar. And that's fine for what you're doing, but I want to encourage you to think about a couple of things here, and then you can tell me if I'm on the right track. I think if you're teaching at a classical school, or if you're going to homeschool all the way through high school, it's important for you and your colleagues to agree, at least in broad terms, on what the outcome of your school's education ought to be. Are you preparing your students for a classical high school, the rhetoric stage? If that is your goal, let me encourage you to examine what is expected of students at that level. Before I began homeschooling my high schoolers, I envisioned reading interesting and challenging literature, some primary sources in history, and I wasn't really worried about it because I'd taken a lot of classes on literature and history in college, and I thought I'd read a lot of stuff. So I kind of had this vague idea of what I was going to be doing, but I wasn't overly concerned. Well, thousands of pages and hours later, I am here to tell you we are mostly pretty uninformed as to what those children are going to have to study at that point. Unless, well, let me just tell you, they're reading Greek and Roman plays and histories. If you're already familiar with Thucydides, Herodotus, Livy, Procopius, Caesar, Quintilian, you're in really good shape. Also, if you do more than just recognize the names Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Machiavelli, at this point, it's no longer good enough just to recognize the names and have a vague idea as to what they're about. The kids actually read these works. And so that's the level of work you're trying to prepare students to do. And it's very challenging. And while it can be enjoyable, it's not the notion of, we're sitting around reading Jane Austen all day. I would love that. This is very hard work, and it's not, like I said, not just fiction, but political science and history. So a variety of topics within literature. Another thing I want to talk to you about in the rhetoric stage is this thing that you've probably heard of and I can't pronounce, called the progymnasmata. Have you heard that term? Okay. It's a list of rhetorical exercises. I think there are 12, 13 of them. And I think you probably do some of them starting in 3rd or 4th grade if you're having your students write out fairy tales, narratives, that type of thing. And I think a couple slides down, I'll show them all to you, so I won't tell you everything about it. But they're very rigid writing exercises that the kids will have to do at a higher level. So, very, very basic information. There are 5 canons of rhetoric. Invention, that's how you come up with an argument. Arrangement, how you arrange your argument. Your style. Then you're expected to memorize it, which obviously I didn't do today. And your delivery. These are all things that they study at the rhetoric level. These are your progymnasmata, and I think you've probably done fables and narratives, possibly anecdotes. The thing is, let me just explain maybe one of these, say the proverb. What the kids do is they get a proverb, and they have to draw from history and perhaps from the Bible and literature, all sorts of little anecdotes that they can use to explain their original proverb. And it's all done in a very set, rigid, specific way. They have to make a thesis and kind of show the opposite of that thesis, and then they have to give an example of it, and then they have to give testimony from people who lived a long time ago or famous people. So there's quite a bit of stuff that they have to come up with, and unless the teacher gives them all of that information, they need to know it already before they get to the stage. So this is part of why what you're doing with your literature classes is important, so that they are exposed to a variety of history and literature, so they have something to actually draw on when it comes time to write these things. And these progymnasmata don't actually get used in the real world then. It goes beyond this. These are just exercises. But if you get to be a little bit familiar with some of these things, it's kind of fun, because when you read the New Testament, the epistles, you say, oh, that's an encomium, that's an invective. People think that the scripture is very simple, and it's not. But fairly simple is Dr. Seuss, right? So I'm going to use a little Dr. Seuss to teach you a little bit about style, which is really one of the later things that you learn at the rhetoric stage as far as writing goes. And that's just playing with words, doing interesting things with words. So you all know one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. That repetition at the end of every phrase is actually a a rhetorical style, a technique called epistrophe. And you know what? There are literally hundreds of these things. I mean, this is just a little book of rhetorical terms, and there are so many ways you can play with words that I have never thought about until recently. Dr. Seuss knew how to do this. Here he has some are thin and some are fat. The fat one has a yellow hat. Ending a sentence in a word and then beginning your next sentence with the same word, that's anadiplosis. Here we're going to see a chiasmus. So, oh dear, I cannot hear. Will you please come over near? Will you please look in my ear? There must be something there, I fear. So, if we look at the next page, and this is not going to be a perfect chiasmus, but chiasmus means a cross, okay? And in writing, sometimes it looks as if you can put a mirror on the page and you see a reflection of the exact same word. So you're going to see this a little bit here. Ear down to ear. And fear down to fear. Dear up to dear. Whoops. And there are only 3 clicks on that page. So, like I said, it's not a perfect one. The Bible is full of these. The Psalms are full of them. Think of the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Okay? So, moving on to the repetition of a single word over and over again. Sometimes you think maybe he couldn't think of anything else to say, but no, it's actually a rhetorical device. Shakespeare uses this all the time. Think of Hamlet. Words, words, words. So, something interesting. Rhetorical questions. These are questions that the audience already knows the answer to and can respond with a simple yes or no. Did you ever fly a kite in bed? Did you ever walk with 10 cats on your head? No. Apparently we should try that. But I love this one. This is my favorite. I don't know how familiar you are with the book. So it starts out, look what we found in the park, in the dark. We will take him home. We will call him Clark. He will live at our house. He will grow and grow. Will our mother like this? We don't know. It's when the writer provides the answer to the question, this hypophora. So just within this one little Dr. Seuss book, we have, and we didn't even look at every single page, what is this, 6 examples of rhetorical style. So why I'm showing you this is just so that when you're choosing literature for your classroom curriculum, look for a few of these things, because I really think that if kids are exposed to these things throughout their earlier academic career, when it comes time for them, because they're supposed to be able to write these things, if they've heard them throughout their earlier years, it'll be much easier for them to have to produce them out of their own heads. And I'll tell you, it's really, really hard for me, but my kids, I can, we'll be talking at lunch, and one of them will say something like, oh, that's a rhetorical device you just used. It's so easy for them. Very hard for us. And how are you supposed to learn these things? I do have help. Number of websites that I go to, because my kids can memorize the names of these things. I'm not so good at it. This one actually has film clips, so you can listen to it. You don't necessarily have to just read it. This is a really good one. And you can type in whatever one you're looking for, and it'll pop up some interesting information. This one is also very good. Obviously, it's out of Utah. Kind of interesting to me. Here's Dr. Tallman's website right here, so you check that out. This is a book that I bought to use with my kids. It's an exercise book. It only picks the top 39 rhetorical devices out of all the hundreds. And the reason I show this one to you is, I don't expect you to learn the names of all these different techniques, but I think this is a very easy book to understand. And if you could just recognize one when you see it, I think it would be helpful for you. It's one of the ways that when parents say, why did you choose this book? You say, well, it has, blah, blah, blah. This will help you to know how to recognize different rhetorical devices. And it's very manageable. And while we're talking about rhetoric, just quickly, this is an introductory sort of reading list for starting with 9th grade. So I don't know what grades you all teach, but this is the level of reading that you're trying to get to. And some of it is very difficult. Some of it might even be a little boring. You never tell the kids that. It's hard work to read through these things. So just so you know, we're supposed to be enjoying literature, but at the same time, you want to be preparing them for, these are, the classic works. If you get onto Mortimer Adler's Great List books, these are on there. So we'll return to the question of the day: why teach children literature? If we define literature, it's writing that contains permanent ideas of universal interest. So these are things that, it's not just for white men. People from any nationality can appreciate these things. And they're also written in good style. Okay? Why teach children literature? Why do we educate them at all? Why do we, as Lutherans, educate our children at all? To help them to know the truth, to keep them in the Word of God, and to help them to function in the world as good neighbors and do the best that they can. So, going to Tolkien very quickly. This is the quote I told you about earlier. He points out that adults commonly make the mistake of treating children as a different species rather than as human beings who are not fully mature. So Tolkien doesn't seem to go with the idea of protecting the child, blah, blah, blah. They're still humans. They're just not fully mature yet. So he says, while children cannot understand everything they read, they need to be challenged. It may be better for them to read some things, especially fairy stories, that are beyond their measure, rather than short of it. Their books, like their clothes, should allow for growth, and their books, at any rate, should encourage it. Now, I was told to leave plenty of time for discussion and for you to just look at books or talk about things. So, what would you like to talk about?